July 1944. World War II was still raging across Europe. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions were dead. Empires were collapsing, and the global economy was in ruins. But while armies fought across continents and the future of civilization itself hung in the balance, 44 nations quietly gathered inside a luxury hotel in the mountains of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. What happened inside that hotel would shape the modern world for the next 80 years. It was called the Bretton Woods Conference, and it may have been one of the most important meetings in modern history because the leaders gathered there weren't just trying to end a war. They were trying to design a new global financial system powerful enough to prevent another Great Depression, another economic collapse, and potentially another world war. The old system had failed. The 1930s had been defined by economic chaos, currency wars, bank failures, hyperinflation, trade collapses, mass unemployment, and rising political extremism. Economic instability helped fuel the rise of authoritarian regimes across the world. And by 1944, global leaders understood something critical. Military power alone could not stabilize civilization. The world needed a new monetary order. So at Bretton Woods, representatives from 44 allied nations came together to build exactly that. The result was one of the most influential financial systems ever created. The conference established the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a new monetary framework centered around the United States dollar. Under the Bretton Woods system, global currencies would be tied to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be tied to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. For the first time in modern history, the world had a relatively stable financial architecture designed around a single dominant reserve currency. And that currency was backed by the industrial and economic power of the United States. That distinction matters, because every major world order throughout history eventually creates a monetary system that reflects its dominant industrial power. The British Empire had the pound sterling. And after World War II, America inherited the global system, not just militarily, financially. The Bretton Woods system helped launch what became known as the American Century. The United States emerged from the war as the world's dominant industrial superpower. American factories powered Reconstruction. American banks financed global growth. American corporations expanded across the world. And the dollar became the foundation of international trade, energy markets, and global finance. For decades, the system worked remarkably well. The post-war era produced one of the largest economic expansions in human history. Global trade exploded, infrastructure expanded, middle classes grew, entire nations rebuilt themselves from the ashes of war. But underneath the prosperity, structural problems slowly began to emerge. Over time, the United States began spending far more than the gold reserves backing the dollar system could realistically support. Military expansion, foreign wars, government spending, debt growth, and eventually the math stopped working. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, foreign governments increasingly questioned whether the United States actually possessed enough gold to back all the dollars circulating around the world. Then came the breaking point. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The Bretton Woods system effectively died, and with it, the modern world entered a completely new monetary era, the age of fiat currency. For the first time in modern history, the global financial system was no longer tied to a tangible asset like gold. Currencies became backed primarily by government confidence, central banking systems, and monetary policy. And in many ways, the modern economy transformed completely after that moment. Debt levels exploded, financialization accelerated, asset bubbles expanded, governments gained unprecedented power to create money, and the global economy became increasingly dependent on central bank intervention. At the same time, globalization accelerated. Manufacturing moved overseas. Supply chains stretched across continents. Financial markets became deeply interconnected. The world became wealthier in some ways, but also far more fragile. And over the last 2 decades, many of the cracks in the system have become increasingly difficult to ignore. Massive sovereign debt, persistent inflation concerns, asset inequality, banking instability, currency weaponization, geopolitical fragmentation. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, and suddenly, trillions of dollars were created almost overnight in order to stabilize the global economy. For many people, it exposed something unsettling. The modern financial system increasingly relies on confidence itself, not scarcity, not hard assets, confidence. At the same time, entirely new technologies have emerged that challenge traditional assumptions about money and financial infrastructure. Blockchain technology introduced the possibility of decentralized, transparent financial systems operating outside traditional banking structures. Bitcoin introduced the concept of digitally scarce assets with finite supply, and suddenly conversations that once sounded fringe began entering mainstream financial institutions, governments, and central banks. Now, to be clear, cryptocurrency is not a perfect solution. The technology remains volatile. Speculative excess still exists. Regulatory uncertainty remains massive. But the underlying technology may represent something far more important than speculation. It may represent the first serious attempt to rebuild monetary trust infrastructure for the digital age, and that raises an enormous question. Are we approaching another Bretton Woods moment? Because today, the global system once again appears to be entering a period of transition. The rise of China, BRICS expansion, de-dollarization efforts, digital currencies, artificial intelligence, energy competition, supply chain nationalism, strategic reshoring. The world is changing again, and historically, major shifts in global power almost always produce changes in monetary systems. That's why I believe it may be time to revisit the spirit of Bretton Woods itself. Not necessarily to recreate the exact same system, but to rethink the architecture of global finance for the 21st century. Imagine world leaders, technologists, economists, and industrial strategists gathering once again at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, not to preserve the old system blindly, but to design a more transparent, resilient, and technologically adaptive financial order, one capable of functioning in a digital world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence, blockchain infrastructure, geopolitical fragmentation, and declining trust in traditional institutions. Because ultimately, monetary systems are not just about economics. They are about power. They determine who controls trade, who finances growth, who absorbs debt, who sets global rules, and which nations dominate the next economic era. The original Bretton Woods Conference shaped the post-war world that emerged after 1945. The question now is whether the current system is beginning to fracture, and whether a new financial architecture will eventually emerge to replace it. Because every major shift in global power eventually creates a new monetary order, and history suggests we may already be living through the beginning of the next transition.